The gun was pressed against Lucy Blackwell's spine before she even had time to draw breath. She had made it all the way across the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, had her fingers wrapped around the iron handle of the stagecoach door, had been 12 seconds away from disappearing again, when the hand clamped down on her shoulder and spun her hard against the wooden post of the telegraph office. The barrel of the revolver found the small of her back with practiced precision, and a voice she had spent 3 years trying to forget curled around her like smoke from a burning building. "Did you really think," Denton Crale said softly, his breath hot against her ear, "that I wouldn't find you?" Lucy did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming brought the wrong kind of attention, or sometimes no attention at all. She kept her face turned toward the weathered wood of the post and forced herself to breathe in a slow, controlled rhythm, even as her heart hammered so violently she could feel it in her teeth. "Denton," she said, keeping her voice as flat and empty as the Kansas plain stretching beyond the town's edge. "Let me go. After I spent 2 years looking." He laughed, and the sound was like gravel shaken in a tin cup. "You took something that belonged to me, Lucy. You know the price for that." She knew. She had always known the price. It was why she had run from Abilene to Dodge, from Dodge to Wichita, and from Wichita to this sun-baked crossroads town that smelled of cattle and coal smoke and other people's desperation. It was why she had changed her hair color twice and taken jobs under 3 different names, and it was why she had never, not once in 3 years, allowed herself to trust anyone enough to stay. And yet staying was precisely what she had done in Caldwell. She had stayed for 6 whole weeks, which was longer than she had stayed anywhere since the night she had fled Abilene with a bruised jaw and a stolen ledger, and the burning knowledge that Denton Crale's entire criminal empire rested on the contents of that little black book. "The ledger," she said. "The ledger," he confirmed. "I don't have it anymore." The gun pressed harder. "Lie to me again and I will put this bullet right through you on a public street and ride out of town before anyone finishes blinking." He meant it. That was the most terrifying thing about Denton Crale. He always meant exactly what he said. The stagecoach she had been about to board lurched and creaked as the driver climbed down from the box, and for one brief, desperate moment, Lucy thought about making a move. She had a small derringer tucked inside her left boot, a habit she had acquired after Abilene, and she had practiced drawing it until the motion was nearly automatic. But with his revolver already against her back and his body pressed close enough that she could feel the brass buttons of his coat, she knew she would not be fast enough. The morning sun was already fierce for early September, 1878, and the main street of Caldwell was not empty. There were 2 ranchers talking outside the feed store, a woman hanging washing on a line between 2 buildings 30 yards away, and a man in a brown duster leaning against the hitching rail outside the sheriff's office, apparently doing nothing more important than watching the street from beneath the brim of his hat. It was that last figure that Lucy's eyes found and fixed upon, not because she expected help. She had stopped expecting help from strangers a long time ago, but because she had learned to catalog exits and witnesses the way other women cataloged recipes. The man in the brown duster straightened. He had seen something. She could tell by the way the negligent slouch left his frame and was replaced by something alert and still, the way a hunting dog goes still when the wind changes. "Walk with me," Denton said, beginning to steer her away from the post. And then a voice she had heard only a handful of times, low and deliberate and carrying the specific unhurried weight of a man who has nothing to prove, cut across the distance between the hitching rail and the telegraph office. "Morning," said Silas Wells. "You got a problem there." Denton went very still. Lucy had seen Silas Wells for the first time 40 days ago, on the day she had arrived in Caldwell. He was the deputy sheriff, a fact she had noted and filed under reasons to be cautious, because in her experience, lawmen were either in Denton Crale's pocket or they became Denton Crale's enemies, and the second category tended to end up buried in shallow graves. He was tall and lean in the way that comes from hard use rather than lean appetite, with dark brown hair that had gone slightly too long behind his ears, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same pale limestone that jutted out of the Kansas soil on the eastern edge of town. He was 29 years old. She knew this because she had made it her business to know everything about everyone in every town she passed through, cataloging them for danger the way other women cataloged recipes. He had not, in 40 days, done anything to make her suspicious. He had been courteous. He had been steady. He had, on one occasion, stepped between her and a drunk cowhand who had mistaken her for a woman of more flexible virtue, and he had done it without drama and without later implying that she owed him anything for it. She had not trusted him anyway. She had not trusted him, and she had not told him anything, and she had kept right on making her quiet plans to leave. But here he was, crossing the street at a deliberate walk, and here she was with a gun against her spine, and the frozen second between his question and Denton's answer felt like the longest moment of her life. "No problem," Denton said, and his voice had shifted into the pleasant, social register that he used when he was performing civility for an audience. "Just having a conversation with my wife." Lucy felt the word like a slap. In 3 years of running, it was the one claim she had never been able to outrun, because it was technically true. She and Denton Crail had been married in a courthouse in Abilene in the spring of 1875, when she had been 22 years old, and had believed his charm and his promises and his beautiful lies. The marriage had lasted 14 months before she had understood what he truly was, and another 10 months after that before she had found the courage and the evidence and the right moment to run. Silas Wells stopped 5 feet away. His hands were loose at his sides, not reaching for his gun but not relaxed either. He looked at Lucy with those steady gray eyes, and she saw him reading the situation with the quick, careful intelligence she had noticed, and tried very hard not to admire about him. "That's so," he said. "Ma'am, you all right?" She had a choice in this moment. She could nod, perform the role of willing wife, and hope that Denton's performance of civility held long enough for her to find another angle. Or she could do the thing she had never done in 3 years of running. She could trust someone. The gun pressed harder against her spine, a warning. She looked at Silas Wells and said very clearly, "No." What happened in the next 30 seconds would later strike her as the most efficient use of half a minute she had ever witnessed. Silas moved left, drawing Denton's attention and the automatic swing of the revolver, and the fraction of space that opened between Lucy's back and Denton's gun was exactly enough for her to drop her weight, step sideways, and put the telegraph office post between herself and the barrel. She heard rather than saw the scuffle, Silas catching Denton's gun arm at the wrist, a sharp crack that was either the gun hitting the boardwalk or someone's knuckle, and then Denton's voice rising into genuine fury in a way his social register could not contain. By the time the dust settled, Denton Crail was face down on the boardwalk, with his hands being tied behind his back by Silas Wells, who was breathing only slightly harder than usual, and the small crowd that had materialized from the doorways of the surrounding buildings was watching with the bright-eyed interest that distinguished frontier entertainment from the theatrical variety. Lucy stood with her back against the post, and her hands shaking, and told herself this did not mean anything. It did not mean she was safe. It did not mean she could stop running. She was still telling herself this 4 hours later, sitting in the chair beside Sheriff Holt's desk while Silas sat on the edge of the desk across from her and watched her with an expression she could not read. "He's locked up," Silas said. "We've sent a wire to Abilene. Apparently there's a warrant out for him there. Horse theft, fraud, and suspicion of murder in connection with a stage robbery." "3 murders," Lucy said. "The 2 stage guards and the driver. I have the evidence." The room went quiet in a specific way, the way rooms go quiet when something important shifts. "The ledger," Silas said. She looked up sharply. "He said something about a ledger when I was cuffing him," Silas said. He was watching her with that careful, reading expression, not suspicious, not accusatory, just patient. "You want to tell me what's going on? The real story, not the version where you're just a woman who happened to have an unpleasant encounter with her husband. The real story. Lucy Blackwell had not told anyone the real story in 3 years. She had told fragments of it, edited versions of it, versions with different names and different details, designed to give her just enough help to get to the next town without giving anyone enough information to follow her or use it against her. The real story was a secret she had carried alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to put it into words. She looked at Silas Wells for a long, assessing moment. She looked for the tells she had learned to read, the slight overinterest, the too casual posture, the eyes that moved to the window or the door when they should have been on her. She had learned to read men the way she had once read novels, with pleasure and then with survival necessity. She found nothing that alarmed her. She found only the same steady, patient attention that had been quietly unsettling her for 40 days. "If I tell you," she said carefully, "it puts you in Denton's crosshairs. He has associates, influential ones." "I have handled influential men before," Silas said without inflection. "Not like Denton Crail." "Probably not," he agreed. "Tell me anyway," she told him. She had not planned to tell him all of it, but once she began, she found that the story had a momentum she could not manage, and it came out complete. The marriage, the slow revelation of Denton's true business, the network of corrupt officials and hired guns that kept his enterprise running across 3 counties, the 14 months of playing the obedient wife while secretly documenting everything, the ledger she had copied by hand over the course of 6 terrifying weeks, and the night she had finally run. She told him about the woman in Dodge who had hidden her for a week before Denton's men had found the trail, and the woman had made it clear, kindly but absolutely clearly, that she could not afford to keep a hunted woman in her house. She told him about the name changes and the hair dye and the jobs she had taken, seamstress, cook, laundress, anything that kept her moving and earning without making her visible. She told him about the copy of the ledger, which she had mailed to her cousin in St. Louis with a letter explaining everything, with instructions to take it to the federal authorities if Lucy had not contacted her within 3 months. She told him, and when she was done she sat back and waited for the shift, for the calculation she had seen in every other face she had trusted even partially, the moment when a person's expression changed as they began to weigh the cost and the benefit of her story. Silas Wells looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "That took courage," he said. "All of it, every part of that story." She blinked. "I beg your pardon," staying long enough to copy the ledger. Running when you had nothing certain to run toward, starting over that many times. He said it simply, as though it were a plain and obvious observation. "That took a tremendous amount of courage." Lucy Blackwell had been called many things in 3 years. She had been called foolish and reckless and stubborn and dishonest. She had been called a thief and a runaway and a bad wife. No one had ever called her courageous. She looked away, out the single window of the sheriff's office, at the bright Kansas afternoon happening with complete indifference beyond the glass. Her eyes were burning in a way she refused to allow to become tears. "I need to write to my cousin," she said. "Tell her not to go to the authorities yet. Denton will try to get word to his associates before the Abilene marshal arrives to collect him. And if his associates know, she has the ledger." "Write the letter," Silas said, standing and moving to the desk. "I'll have it on the afternoon stage personally." She looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" He paused with his hand on the letter paper. He seemed to genuinely consider the question as though it were a reasonable one, as though her asking it was not an indication of the damage she was carrying around inside her chest. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, "and because you need help. Those 2 reasons are usually enough." She watched him set the paper and the ink pot on the side table nearest to her, watched him arrange them with a small, careful precision that somehow moved her more than a large gesture would have. She picked up the pen and began to write. The afternoon passed. The letter went on the stage. The marshal from Abilene sent back a reply to the wire that confirmed the warrant and set an arrival date of 4 days hence. Denton Crail sat in the Caldwell jail and said nothing to anyone, which was the behavior of a man who was waiting for a rescue rather than a man who had accepted his situation. This was the detail that kept Lucy awake that night in her small rented room above the millinery. She lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the 3 names she knew from the ledger, the names of Denton's most reliable hired guns. Men named Archer, Prout, and a man known only as the Galveston, because he had come up from the Gulf Coast and never lost the particular quality of stillness that people from flat, waterlogged places seemed to carry with them into the dry interior. She had never seen any of them, only read about them in Denton's careful, coded handwriting. But she knew what they did. She knew the kind of men they were. If Denton had managed to get word to them before Silas had locked him up, they could be in Caldwell inside of 2 days. She told herself she should leave. She had her bag, she had her money, she had the skills she had acquired in 3 years of strategic disappearing. She could be on the early morning stage and into the next county before sunrise. She lay there telling herself this until the candle burned down and the room went dark, and she still had not moved. She was still there in the morning. She came downstairs at first light and found, to her complete surprise, that Silas Wells was sitting at the kitchen table of the boarding house that the millinery owner, a Mrs. Clara Hatch, kept in addition to her shop. He was drinking coffee and talking to Mrs. Hatch in an easy, unhurried manner, and when Lucy appeared in the doorway, still somewhat disheveled from the night's inadequate sleep, he looked up without surprise. "Coffee," he said. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Having breakfast," he said. "Same as most mornings. Mrs. Hatch keeps the best kitchen in Caldwell." He said this with a small, sideways smile in Mrs. Hatch's direction, and the older woman made a dismissive sound that was clearly delighted. Lucy sat down across from him because the alternative was to stand in the doorway, and she was too tired for that level of self-conscious posturing. Mrs. Hatch put a cup of coffee in front of her, and Lucy wrapped both hands around it and let the heat seep into her palms and thought about the previous night's sleeplessness, and the names in the ledger, and the particular way that trouble had a habit of arriving from directions she wasn't watching. "You didn't leave," Silas said. He said it without judgment, without the specific note of satisfaction that men sometimes used when a woman did what they had silently expected her to do. He said it as though he was simply noting a fact. "I thought about it," she said. "I know." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "How? Because you've left everywhere else," he said. "And I'm not saying that as a criticism. Given what you told me yesterday, leaving was the intelligent choice every single time. You were protecting yourself with the tools you had available." She set the cup down. But Denton's associates may already be coming," he said. "Leaving now puts you back on the road alone, which is where you're most vulnerable. Staying puts you in a town with a jail and a deputy sheriff, and if I wire the county seat, the possibility of additional law enforcement before the Abilene marshal arrives." "That is a very logical argument," Lucy said. "I've been practicing it since 4 in the morning," he said, and there was something in the straight delivery of that admission that made her want to laugh, and she had not wanted to laugh in so long that the impulse startled her. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window. "There's something else," she said. "If I stay and Denton's men come and something happens to someone in this town because of me, because of my choices, that's on Denton," Silas said firmly. "That has always been on Denton. You didn't create his crimes or his associates. You uncovered them. The responsibility for what his men do belongs to him." "You really believe that?" she said. "With everything I've got," he said. The conversation ended there, because Mrs. Hatch brought plates of eggs and bread and resumed her cheerful domestic commentary, and Lucy found herself eating a proper breakfast for the first time in longer than she could precisely account for, and the simple human ordinariness of it undid something small and tight in her chest that she had not realized was wound so hard. The next 2 days passed in a state of armed watchfulness that Lucy had become expert at sustaining. She stayed close to the main street. She learned the layout of the sheriff's office and the two exits from it. She kept her derringer loaded and her boots laced. She slept lightly and woke at every noise. What she had not expected was Silas. He appeared with a consistency that was not smothering and not casual, a specific frequency that she eventually understood was deliberate, calibrated to be present enough to be helpful without being close enough to be confining. He ate breakfast at Mrs. Hatch's table. He came by the millinery in the afternoon on his rounds. He found, occasionally, reasons to be in the general vicinity of wherever she happened to be, and he always made sure she could see him coming from a distance, which she understood, without him ever saying so, was intentional. He was giving her the chance to decide how close to let him be. This was such an unprecedented courtesy that she did not know, at first, what to do with it. She had been married to a man who treated her presence and her absence as matters he alone determined. She had been in towns where the moment a woman was unattended, she became a problem to be solved by whatever man was nearest. She had been offered help that came with invisible price tags and visible conditions. Silas Wells offered nothing with conditions. He simply remained available, steady, and extraordinarily patient with a woman who, she was fully aware, gave very little back. On the afternoon of the second day, sitting on the bench outside the millinery in the long golden light of a Kansas September afternoon, Lucy said, without particular preamble, "My real name is Lucy Blackwell, not Lucy Denton, which is the name on the marriage certificate, and not Lucy Rivers, which is the name I've been using here." Silas, sitting beside her with his hat on his knee, turned to look at her. "Blackwell," he said. "From Kansas. Originally Missouri," she said. "My father was a surveyor. We moved around a good deal when I was a child." She paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you that. Maybe because it's true and you're tired of saying things that aren't," he said. She looked at her hands in her lap. "That is an uncomfortably accurate observation." "I didn't mean it to be uncomfortable," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it accurate." There was a silence. A wagon rolled past on the main street. A dog barked somewhere behind the feed store and then went quiet. "My father died 2 years ago," she said, for no reason she could clearly explain. "I got the letter in Wichita, but I couldn't go back for the burial because Denton had men in every town within 2 days of our old county. I just held the letter and kept moving." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's a particular kind of loneliness, grieving on the run." "Everything is lonely on the run," she said, and was immediately embarrassed by the baldness of it. "Yes," he said, "I expect it is." He did not try to fix it. He did not offer her a list of things that were better now or would be better soon. He simply acknowledged what she had said and let it sit there in the warm afternoon air, and she found to her surprise that simply having it acknowledged was somehow enough. That was the afternoon the first thread of something real began to form between them, fragile as spider silk and twice as strong for being made of nothing but honesty. The trouble arrived on the morning of the third day. Lucy had woken before dawn with the particular prickling in her scalp that she had learned to trust absolutely, the early warning system that years of running had developed in her the way sailors develop a sense for weather. She was dressed and downstairs before the sky had shifted from black to gray, and she was standing in Mrs. Hatch's kitchen with her derringer in her boot and her eyes on the back door when she heard the horse. Not a horse passing through, a horse stopping. She moved to the side window and looked out through the thin curtain at the alley running behind the millinery. In the gray pre-dawn, she could make out 2 figures on horseback, and a third standing on the ground beside a horse he was holding by the bridle. 3 men, moving with the specific quiet purpose of people who do not want to be heard. She did not run for the back door. She ran for the front. Silas was at the sheriff's office when she came through the door at a dead run, and he was on his feet before she had finished crossing the threshold, reading her face with that instant, focused attention. 3 men, she said, behind the millinery, 2 mounted, 1 on foot. He moved immediately, no wasted motion, no questions she could not answer. He crossed to the gun rack, pulled down a Winchester, and was loading it in 2 smooth movements. "Wake the sheriff," he said. "His house is the blue door on the corner. Tell him Prout or Archer may be in town." She went. She ran the 40 yards to the blue door and hammered on it and woke Sheriff Holt, a broad, gray-haired man of 50 who had clearly dealt with pre-dawn emergencies before, because he was pulling on his boots before she had finished explaining. What happened in the next hour was the most frightening thing Lucy had experienced since Abilene, and that was a high bar. 2 of the 3 men turned out to be associates of Denton's, but not the named hired guns, which was both a relief and not, because it meant she did not know their capabilities. They had come to break Denton out of the Caldwell jail, and they had underestimated the town's law enforcement, which was, she would later understand, because Denton had underestimated Silas. There was a confrontation in the alley behind the jail. There were shots fired. No one was killed, though one of Denton's men was wounded in the shoulder, and both were subsequently arrested. The 3rd man, the one who had been standing, had turned out not to be with them at all, but a traveler who had stopped to water his horse in the wrong alley at the wrong hour, and who was deeply shaken by the whole experience and spent the rest of the morning telling anyone who would listen about it at the saloon. Denton, when Silas went to check on him in the jail cell, had said nothing but had looked at Lucy, who had come along because she refused to stay in the boarding house waiting, with an expression of such pure and vicious hatred that she had to look away. "He's going to Abilene in 2 days, Silas said, when they were standing outside the jail in the growing light of the morning. "The marshal arrives tomorrow," Lucy nodded. She was still coming down from the adrenaline, and her hands were steadier than she expected, but her legs felt unreliable. "Sit down," Silas said, with a quiet authority that was nothing like a command, more like an invitation. She sat down on the step of the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office and put her face in her hands for a moment and breathed. She heard him sit beside her. "He is going to be convicted," she said, from behind her hands. "With the ledger your cousin has," Silas said, "I believe he will be, yes. And his associates. The ones in the ledger. The federal marshals will be involved once your cousin delivers it." She took her hands away from her face and looked at the waking street. A woman with a market basket was walking on the opposite side. The smell of bread baking was drifting from somewhere nearby. "I have been running for 3 years," Lucy said. "I have been in 11 towns. I have had 7 different jobs and 4 different names." She paused. "I don't know how to stop." Silas was quiet beside her for a moment. The morning was warming around them, the September sun just cresting the flat line of the horizon and pushing long golden shadows down the main street of Caldwell. "I think," he said carefully, "that stopping might feel a lot like falling the first time." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the street, and the profile of his face in the early light had the quality of something very old and very patient, and she felt the most dangerous thing she had felt in years, which was the fragile, treacherous beginning of safety. "You're not afraid of me," she said. He turned to look at her then, and there was something in his expression that was both warm and completely serious. "No," he said. "Most men," she said, "find a woman with a hidden past and a criminal husband and a copy of a criminal ledger to be somewhat alarming. I find you to be a remarkable person who survived an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances," he said. "That's not alarming. That's impressive." Lucy Blackwell, who had not cried in front of another person since the night she had left Abilene, felt her throat close up with a force that was almost physical. She looked away, back at the street, and spent a moment doing the controlled breathing she had long ago developed for exactly this kind of moment. "Tell me about you," she said when she trusted her voice again. "I've told you everything. You know almost nothing." He seemed to appreciate the directness of the trade. He settled back slightly, his elbows on his knees, and looked at the middle distance with an expression of thoughtful consideration. "I grew up in Ohio," he said. "My father was a schoolteacher, my mother ran a boarding house, which is perhaps why Mrs. Hatch's kitchen feels familiar to me. I came west after the war, by which I mean after I was old enough for the war to be over by the time I arrived, which is its own kind of particular guilt, being born too late to serve and too early to escape knowing what you missed. You wanted to fight, she said. I wanted to matter, he said simply. I was 17 when it ended. I came west because coming west seemed like the kind of thing that could make a person matter. He paused. I have been in Caldwell for 4 years. I became deputy because the previous one left to go to Denver and the sheriff needed someone who could read and had steady hands. I like the work. I like Caldwell. Another pause. I had not before this week found a very strong reason to stay here permanently. The implication in that last sentence was as clear and as carefully understated as everything else about him, and Lucy heard it with her entire body, a warmth that started somewhere central and moved outward toward her hands and her face. Silas, she said. You don't have to respond to that, he said quickly. I'm not asking anything. I just wanted to be honest with you since you've been very honest with me. She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had been studying for 40 days without admitting that she was studying it, at the gray eyes and the careful jaw, and the way he held himself with a quietness that was not emptiness but something more like readiness. I have spent 3 years believing that trusting anyone was a luxury I could not afford, she said. I made one catastrophic error in trusting the wrong person, and I have been paying for it ever since. And the payment has made me into someone who assumes the worst about everyone's motives as a matter of survival. She stopped. I am telling you this because you deserve to know what you're dealing with, not as a warning to stay away. He looked at her with steady, absolutely level attention. What is it as then? As an explanation, she said, for why it will take me longer than it should to let you in, and possibly as an apology in advance for all the times I will second-guess and push back and find reasons to doubt because I will. I can't promise you I won't. He was quiet for a beat, and then he said, I'm not looking for someone who has it all sorted out. I'm looking for someone real. She felt the words land somewhere behind her sternum. Also, he added, with a restraint she found both maddening and wonderful, I'm not suggesting you make any decisions right now. You've had a very challenging week. She surprised herself by laughing. It was a short, slightly unsteady sound, but it was real, and she could feel the realness of it all the way through her, like water after a long thirst. That, she said, is the most diplomatic understatement I have heard in years. He smiled at her then, a full smile, not the careful quarter smile she had been cataloging for 40 days, and it transformed his face in a way that struck her as entirely unfair, because she had been working very hard not to find him attractive, and a smile like that made the whole effort retroactively useless. The marshal from Abilene arrived the following afternoon. His name was Marshal Gideon Cross, and he was a spare, weathered man of 55 who carried himself with the unhurried authority of a person who had been in law enforcement longer than some people had been alive. He reviewed Silas's documentation, spoke briefly and carefully with Lucy, confirmed the details of the warrants, and informed them that the federal investigation was already underway, and that the delivery of the original ledger by Lucy's cousin, which had apparently occurred 3 days previously, and before Lucy's letter had even arrived, had set things in motion considerably. Your cousin, Marshal Cross said to Lucy, is a very determined young woman. She apparently went to the federal office in St. Louis the morning after she received your letter. The investigation into Crail's network is now the concern of the federal marshals. Your testimony will be needed, but you are no longer the only person standing between Crail and freedom. Lucy sat with this information for a long moment. For 3 years, she had been running partly because she had understood, with absolute clarity, that the ledger was the only thing keeping Denton from being untouchable, and she was the only person who knew where the ledger was, and therefore she was both an asset and a target, and the whole architecture of the problem rested on her remaining both mobile and alive. The weight of that had been so constant that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound when it goes on long enough. Now, with Marshal Cross's quiet, matter-of-fact words, that weight shifted. Not gone, but distributed, finally, among other hands. She became aware that her shoulders had come down from somewhere near her ears to their actual anatomical position. She became aware that her jaw had unclenched. She became aware of Silas, standing near the door of the sheriff's office, watching her with an expression of careful attention, and she thought, with startling clarity, "He is watching to see if I am all right, and that is all he is doing." Denton Crail left Caldwell in custody of Marshal Cross on the morning of the fourth day, in a wagon under guard with his 2 associates from the alley. He passed the sheriff's office on his way out of town, and he looked for Lucy and the small group of people who had gathered to watch. And when he found her, he stared at her with that particular vicious stillness that was the truest expression of who he was. She looked back at him without flinching. She had spent 3 years being afraid of that stare. She let herself feel the fear move through her, and then she let it go, because he was in chains in a wagon, and she was standing on free ground, and the ledger was in federal hands, and she did not need to run anymore. She did not look away from him until the wagon turned the corner at the end of the street. Then she let out a breath that she felt had been held for 3 years. Silas came to stand beside her. He said nothing, and she was grateful for the silence. "I don't know what to do now," she said after a moment. "I genuinely don't know what you do when you stop running." "I imagine," he said, "you start by doing whatever you feel like doing, just for one day, without making a plan." She considered this. "I feel like sitting somewhere quiet and not thinking about exits." "There's a bench by the water pump on the east side of town," he said. "It faces the prairie. Nobody much goes there." They went there. They sat on the bench, which was a simple wooden affair someone had set up between 2 cottonwood trees that provided a little shade in the long afternoon, and looked out at the flat immensity of the Kansas plain stretching east under a sky that was, she thought, almost aggressively blue. She said nothing for a long time, and neither did he, and the silence was the most comfortable silence she had been in for years, because it required nothing from her. It was not the silence of waiting for danger or the silence of performing invisibility. It was simply quiet. "Do you ever think about leaving Caldwell?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "but I never find a compelling enough reason. I like the flatness of it. It's easier to see things coming." She laughed softly. "I spent 3 years in the flattest country in America, and I still didn't see things coming." "You saw the men in the alley," he pointed out. "I suppose I did," she said. "That took practice," he said, "and practice took time and courage. You shouldn't discount that." She was quiet for a moment. The prairie wind moved through the cottonwood leaves above them with a sound like water. A hawk was riding a thermal far to the east. So far it was only a detail against the immensity of sky. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what I would do if I stayed." He was very still beside her. "Was a teacher," she said, "before Abilene for 2 years in a schoolhouse in Jefferson City. I liked it very much." She paused. "Caldwell has a school, doesn't it? I've seen the building." "We have a school," he said, with a careful evenness that she recognized as a man trying not to betray hope. "The teacher left last spring to go back east. Mrs. Hatch has been conducting classes on an informal basis, but she'll be the first to admit it is not her strength." "I have a teaching certificate," Lucy said. "From Jefferson City. It is under my real name, which I have not used in 3 years, but it is valid." "I expect," Silas said in the same careful voice, "that Sheriff Holt would be very interested in speaking with you about the position." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the prairie, his profile still and composed, but there was a quality to his stillness that was charged, like the air before a thunderstorm, and she felt answering warmth moving through her in a long, slow wave. "Silas," she said. He turned to look at her. "I want to stay," she said, "not because there's nowhere else to go. Not because it's practical, though it is. Because," she stopped and arranged her words with the care they deserved. "Because in 6 weeks this is the only place I have been able to breathe, and in 4 days you are the only person who has made me feel like myself, like the person I was before I made the worst mistake of my life and married a criminal." He looked at her for a long, serious moment. "You are not defined by that mistake," he said. "I know," she said. You've made that very clear. That's part of what I'm trying to tell you." He turned on the bench to face her more fully, and she saw in his expression the same transparency she had been struggling to match for days. The honest, unprotected feeling of a person who is not performing anything, not managing or calculating, just present. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "You've had a great deal happen in a very short time. You have a legal situation still unfolding. You need time to simply be still before you make decisions about what comes next." "I know all of that," she said. "I'm not proposing anything rash. I'm telling you how I feel because you told me how you feel and because you deserve the same honesty in return." He reached across the small distance between them on the bench and took her hand, carefully, the way you might reach for something you weren't entirely sure you were allowed to touch. His hand was large and warm and slightly rough with work, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt it not as a constraint but as its exact opposite, as an anchor. "All right," he said. "Then I will tell you again. I have not found a compelling reason to stay in Caldwell permanently until this week." He paused. "Now I have found one." She looked at their hands, her slender ones enclosed in his, and thought about all the running she had done, and all the places she had been, and all the careful, contained, exhausting loneliness of a person who has learned that the only safe space is the space inside themselves. She thought about how much she had given up and how much she had preserved, and how the preserving had cost her in ways she was only now beginning to be able to count. She turned her hand over in his and held on. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most instructive of Lucy Blackwell's life. She became the schoolteacher of Caldwell. She stood before Sheriff Holt with her teaching certificate and her real name and her real story, all of which Silas had quietly vouched for, and she accepted the position with a formality that struck her as slightly absurd given everything, and she moved from Mrs. Hatch's upstairs room into the small house adjacent to the schoolhouse that was provided for the teacher, and she swept it out and aired the curtains and arranged her small collection of belongings in the drawers and cupboards, and stood in the center of the main room and felt the impossible, terrifying, extraordinary sensation of being home. She cried for about 20 minutes. Then she made tea and sat by the window and watched the evening come in across the prairie and felt the crying become something else, something lighter, and let it become that. School began on the 1st of October. She had 14 students, ranging from 6 to 14, and they were on the whole a chaotic and wonderful collection of frontier children, practical and resourceful and simultaneously ignorant of things she had taken for granted in Missouri and knowledgeable about things she had never considered. She loved it immediately and completely, with the whole of herself, in the way that people love things they were genuinely made for. Silas came to school on the second day to speak to the older children about the law, which she later understood was a regular occurrence, and part of the informal civic education she had not yet catalogued. She watched him from the side of the room while he spoke, watched him hold the attention of 14 children of wildly varying ages and interests through the force of nothing more than genuine, uncomplicated engagement, and felt the depth of her feeling for him like a physical thing, like standing too close to a fire and choosing to stay there. After the children had gone home, he sat at the edge of a student desk, which was too small for him in a way that should have been undignified but was somehow only endearing, and watched her tidy the room. "You're good at this," he said. "I know," she said without false modesty. "I was always good at it. I should never have stopped." "You didn't stop," he said. "You were stopped." She paused in her tidying and turned to look at him. "That is a meaningful distinction." "It is the accurate one," he said. She resumed tidying. "Do you know what I thought about every time I arrived in a new town?" she said. "Besides exits and risks and where to keep my money." "What?" "Whether there was a school," she said. "Whether there were children who needed a teacher. I told myself it was just a habit of observation, but now I think it was something more." "Hope," he said. She considered this. "Hope that I would eventually stop. Hope that there would eventually be somewhere I could be that person again. She set the last book on its shelf and turned to face him. You are the first person I ever told that to. He stood from the inadequate desk and crossed the room, and the few feet between them disappeared with a deliberateness that she felt in her entire body, and he stopped close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes, which was not the flat gray of overcast sky, but something warmer, the gray of water with light in it. You don't have to pretend here, he said, and his voice was low and absolutely direct, without performance or self-consciousness. You don't have to be the woman who doesn't need anything, or the woman with no past, or the woman who is always about to leave. You can just be yourself, whatever that is, whatever that turns out to be. Lucy Blackwell stood in her schoolroom in the fading afternoon light of an October day in Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1878, and felt the last of the running leave her body like a long-held breath. She had run from Abilene to Dodge to Wichita to Caldwell, and through 11 towns and 4 names in 3 years of solitary, exhausting survival, and she had arrived here in this room with this man, and something inside her that had been locked and braced and armored since the night she had fled Abilene with a bruised jaw and a stolen ledger finally, quietly, let go. She stopped running, not as a decision exactly, though it was a decision, more as a recognition, the recognition that the thing she had been running toward, safety and stillness and the right to be fully, honestly herself, was here, had been here for 6 weeks while she had been preparing to leave it. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and his eyes softened with something she had no doubt about naming by then, and she said, "Then I won't." He covered her hand with his, and she thought briefly, with a kind of internal humor, that for a man who had been patient for 6 weeks and 40 days and then some, he showed admirable restraint in kissing her with a gentleness that was nonetheless extremely thorough, a quality she had begun to understand was characteristic of everything Silas Wells did. November came cold and clear across the Kansas plain. The federal case against Denton Crail moved forward with the efficiency of a system that had been waiting a long time for evidence this solid. Lucy received letters from Marshall Cross with periodic updates, and she read them carefully and filed them in a drawer and went on teaching and going on. The letters were hard to read, sometimes, because even a criminal you have long since stopped loving represents a chapter of your life, a chapter with loss and waste and error in it, and the closing of it does not feel as clean as you might hope. But she read them and she went on. She received a letter from her cousin Eleanor, who turned out to be every bit as determined as Marshall Cross had suggested, and who had not only delivered the ledger to the federal office, but had apparently done so with enough eloquence and insistence that the case had been assigned to a senior investigator rather than sitting in a pile. Eleanor was coming to visit in the spring. Lucy wrote back with a warmth she had not felt entitled to express in 3 years, and the letter took her a long time to write, because she kept having to stop and sit with the feeling. The days grew shorter, and the schoolroom required more firewood, and the children came in pink-cheeked from the cold and stamped their feet on the mat, and she felt, daily and consistently, the pleasure of work she was suited for among people she was learning to love. Silas took to stopping by the schoolhouse in the evenings, after the children were gone and she was preparing the next day's lessons. He would bring something, sometimes, a small thing from the general store or Mrs. Hatch's kitchen, nothing grand, nothing that would have been considered a formal gesture of courtship in more formal society. Just small, regular, quiet attentions that accumulated over time into something that felt more substantial than grand gestures would have. They talked in those evenings with the ease of people who have discovered, to their mutual relief, that conversation with the right person is not an effort but a pleasure. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, about his father's classroom and the particular quality of his parents' marriage, which was, he said, one of those rare and slightly irritating partnerships where 2 people are genuinely well suited for each other and know it, and make it look easy. She told him about her mother, who had died when Lucy was 12, and her father's patient, slightly bewildered devotion to a daughter he clearly loved, but understood less well than he understood surveying. She told him about Jefferson City and the schoolroom there and the 2 years of genuine happiness she had had before Abilene, before the charming man with beautiful lies had arrived in her life. How did he seem? Silas asked once, and the question was without judgment, entirely interested. When you first met him, what did he seem like? Interesting, she said without hesitation. That was the thing, he was genuinely interesting. He knew things and he asked questions and he listened to the answers, which in my experience at that time was not common. She paused. He performed interest very well. It was only later that I understood it was performance. He was gathering information. He was figuring out how I worked so that he could manage me more efficiently. That's a particularly cold-blooded way of thinking about another person, Silas said. Yes, she said. That is what he was. A silence. You're not afraid, she said, of the fact that I made that mistake, that I believed him for as long as I did. No, he said. Most people would find that a reflection of poor judgment. Most people, he said, have not tried to deceive you. I have no reason to think your judgment of the actual unperforming person in front of you is anything but excellent. She looked at him. You are doing it again. Doing what? Saying the exact right thing without appearing to try. He smiled. I'm trying considerably harder than I appear to be. December arrived and brought with it a cold that was startling in its directness. The flat plains giving the wind no obstacle between the north and wherever you happened to be standing. Lucy had been to cold winters before, but never to Kansas cold, which was a specific and businesslike variety that got on with the matter efficiently. She learned to stack her firewood close to the door. She learned the way the stove in the schoolhouse needed to be managed in the deep cold. She learned the faces the children made when the cold was genuinely uncomfortable versus when they were simply bored and wanted to be released early, and she was sympathetic to both but more to the former. On a Sunday afternoon in the middle of December, she was sitting by the fire in her small house, correcting arithmetic exercises, when Silas knocked on the door. She opened it and found him standing on her step in the cold, hatless, which was unusual, and with an expression that was doing something she had not seen it do before, a quality of contained energy, a bright seriousness. Come in, she said. It's freezing. He came in and stood just inside the closed door and did not sit down, which told her immediately that this was not a stopping by in the evening visit. I want to say something, he said. And I want to say it directly because I think you appreciate directness. I do, she said, setting down the arithmetic exercises. I love you, he said. I have known it for some time, since October at the latest, and I have been giving you time and space to settle into being here and being safe, which I believe was the right thing to do, but I did not want to carry this into the new year without saying it plainly. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come west looking for a way to matter and had ended up mattering to her in a way she had not known to hope for. Silas, she said. You don't have to say anything back, he said quickly. I'm not asking anything in return. I just needed you to know. Silas, she said again, and crossed the small room to stand in front of him and put both hands on the front of his coat and looked up at him. I love you. I have been aware of it since some point in October when you sat in a child's desk and said something characteristically accurate, and I realized I had completely stopped thinking of this town as a temporary arrangement. The contained, bright seriousness in his expression broke into something warmer and wider, and he put his arms around her in a way that felt, she thought, like the physical expression of everything he had been offering her since the moment he had crossed a Caldwell street and asked a question that had changed her life. She stood in the warmth of his arms in her small house by her fire and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that the world was exactly the size it was supposed to be, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be in it. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday in January in the proper, considered way, with the question put clearly and the context offered without pressure, and she said yes with a simplicity and a completeness that surprised her, because she had not expected, after everything Abilene had done to her relationship with that particular institution, to feel anything but complicated about it. She felt uncomplicated. She felt clear. She felt, and she told him this, which made him laugh, as though the institution of marriage had simply been waiting all along for the right application. They were married in March of 1879, in the small church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a day when the first green was just beginning to come back into the plains after the winter, and the sky was that specific, unarguable blue that Kansas spring produces, and that Lucy had come to think of as a personal statement of intent by the landscape. Mrs. Hatch cried. Sheriff Holt stood straight and solemn as a witness. Eleanor, Lucy's cousin, had arrived the week before for the visit that had been planned since November and stood in the front pew with the pleased, slightly vindicated expression of a woman who had carried a ledger to the federal office and always known it would come to this. The ceremony was short. What came after was not. What came after was a life. The town of Caldwell grew around them, as frontier towns were doing across the territory in those years, adding buildings and residents and a second general store and eventually a real doctor, in a white house on the corner near the telegraph office. The cattle drives continued to come through, filling the main street with noise and dust and the particular commerce of the frontier, and Lucy grew accustomed to the rhythms of it, the seasons of the plains with their absolute extremes, the furious heat of summer, and the magnificent cold of winter, and the breathtaking transitional violence of spring storms. Silas became sheriff in the summer of 1880. When Holt retired to a small farm, he had been accumulating the money for over 20 years, and turned the office over to his deputy with a ceremony consisting primarily of handing over the badge and saying gruffly that Silas had been doing the actual work for years anyway, and he was only formalizing the arrangement. Silas accepted the badge with the same quietness with which he accepted most things and continued doing the work, and Lucy watched from the schoolroom as the town accorded him the respect that she had known was owed him since the morning he had crossed the street with his hands loose at his sides and asked a single question. Eleanor stayed for 6 weeks of the spring of 1879 and left promising to come back, and kept her promise the following spring, and the spring after that, and eventually simply became a regular feature of the Wells household, arriving in March and staying through June, which suited everyone extremely well. The federal case against Denton Crail concluded in the autumn of 1879, with a conviction on 3 counts of murder and multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Lucy read the letter from Marshall Cross, which was formal and precise, and conveyed the verdict and sentence in the clean language of legal documentation, and she sat with it for a morning, allowing whatever she needed to feel to move through her. And then she put it in the drawer with the other letters and went to school and taught her students long division. She told Silas that evening, sitting by their fire in the small house that had by now accumulated the comfortable, inhabited quality of a genuine home, with her books on the shelves and his coat on the hook by the door and the particular domestic archaeology of 2 people building a life together. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. "I feel," she said slowly, "like I should feel more or differently or something." "What do you feel?" She thought about it. "Mostly I feel like making supper," she said. "And that seems wrong given the weight of the thing, but when I try to reach for something larger it isn't there, just the ordinary evening." "That," he said, "is what it feels like when something is genuinely over, not dramatic, just ordinary on the other side." She looked at him. "You are still doing the thing." "I am going to stop apologizing for being occasionally accurate," he said, and she laughed. They made supper. They ate it together in the light of the lamp on the table, talking about the day's small events and the week's coming ones. And when she looked across the table at him in that ordinary light, and with that ordinary meal and that ordinary conversation, She thought that this was the thing she had been running toward for 3 years without knowing it, this particular ordinary life with this particular extraordinary man. Their son was born in June of 1881. Lucy had been teaching until the last practical week of the pregnancy, which had been a source of mild consternation to several of the town's women and a source of complete unsurprise to anyone who knew her. Silas had been, throughout, the model of a man who understood that his preferences regarding his wife's activities were exactly that, his preferences, and who expressed them once and then stepped back. The birth was attended by Dr. Rawlings, the doctor who had come to Caldwell the previous year, and by Mrs. Hatch, who had delivered enough babies in her lifetime to constitute a professional qualification. It was long and difficult and at several points deeply frightening, and Silas sat outside the bedroom door for 12 hours with the specific contained quality of a man who is maintaining composure by main force of will. When it was done, and Mrs. Hatch came out to tell him he could come in, he crossed the room to the bed where Lucy lay exhausted and complicated with feeling, holding their son, and sat beside her and looked at this small, new person with an expression she had never seen on his face before and could not have described except that it was completely unguarded and completely real. "He looks furious," Silas said. "Most newborns do," said Dr. Rawlings, packing his bag. "He looks like you," Lucy said, which was not entirely true and was entirely true, the way things can be both. "What shall we call him?" Silas asked. They had discussed names. They had not decided. Now, looking at this actual specific person who had arrived into their life, and not the theoretical child they had been naming in the abstract, Lucy found that only one name seemed to fit. "James," she said. "For my father." Silas looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the understanding of what the name meant, not just a name but a reclamation, a bridge across the grief of the years her father had died without her being able to come home to bury him, a way of carrying something forward that had been lost. "James Wells," he said, "that's a strong name." James Wells turned out to be a strong, curious, loud-opinionated child who walked at 10 months and was asking unreasonable questions by the time he was 2.5. Lucy returned to teaching in September when James was 3 months old, bringing him to school in the basket that served as his portable domain, and managing the arrangement with the practical creativity that had become one of her defining characteristics. The schoolroom was full by 1882, full enough that Caldwell's growing population was making the case for a second teacher, and Lucy was involved in the interview and selection process with the investment of someone who considered the education of frontier children a matter of genuine civic importance, which she did. Eleanor came in the spring of 1882 and stood in the schoolroom while Lucy taught and afterwards said, with the straightforward honesty that was the quality Lucy had always loved most in her cousin, that watching Lucy teach was one of the most satisfying things she had witnessed in her life, and that the teacher Lucy had been before Abilene had been excellent. But the teacher Lucy had become was something extraordinary, because she taught not just the subjects but the quality of surviving and continuing. Simply by being the person she was, Lucy had to sit down after that and look at the ceiling for a while. In the spring of 1883, there was an afternoon, one of those Kansas afternoons in late April when the weather is still deciding between the coldness it came from and the warmth it's heading toward, and the sky has a quality of vast, waiting clarity, when Silas came to the schoolhouse after the children had gone home and found Lucy standing at the window looking out at the prairie. He came to stand beside her without asking what she was looking at, which was one of the 1,000 small things she loved about him. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "The running, the town, what would have happened if I'd gotten on that stage?" "I try not to," he said. "What would have happened is not the thing that happened, and the thing that happened is what I have." She turned to look at him. 2 years of marriage and a son and the daily commerce of building a life together had done nothing to diminish the specific quality of her feeling for him, which was, she had decided, simply one of those facts about herself she had learned to accept with the gratitude it deserved. "Silas," she said. "Lucy," he said, in the same tone, which was warm and faintly amused in a way that meant he knew she was about to say something significant. "I'm going to have another baby," she said. He turned from the window to face her completely, and the expression that crossed his face went through surprise and then something deep and warm and finally settled into the same unguarded quality she had seen when he had first looked at James, the real face behind all the careful composure. "When?" he asked. "October, I expect," she said. He put his arms around her there in the schoolroom in the golden afternoon light, and she leaned into him with the whole of herself, without reservation, and without the armor she had once worn constantly, because she was home and he was home, and there was nowhere to run to and nowhere she wanted to run. Their daughter arrived in late October of 1883, during a prairie thunderstorm that rattled the windows of the small house and made the lamps gutter, and gave the whole event a dramatic quality that James, now 2 years old, found entirely too exciting and was required to experience from Mrs. Hatch's kitchen rather than the family bedroom. She was smaller than James had been and darker-haired, and came into the world with a specific intensity of expression that made Dr. Rawlings observe that she appeared to have opinions already. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Hatch, who cried for the second time in her life in connection with the Wells family, and then was extremely brisk about it. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, with the ordinary, extraordinary events of children growing and learning, and being difficult and wonderful, with the work of school and the work of law and the work of building something real in a place that was still writing its own story. The cattle trade continued and then began to diminish, and the railroad changed the character of the frontier in ways that were both loss and gain, and Caldwell changed around them, growing into something more settled and less raw. Lucy stood in the schoolroom one afternoon in 1885, a warm October afternoon that had a quality of golden completeness, looking at her students with their bent heads over their slates, and thought about the woman she had been in 1878 with a gun against her spine and a 3-year habit of running, and about the road between that woman and this one, and about the specific decisions and moments and a single question asked across a dusty Caldwell street that had made the difference. She thought about Silas saying, in her schoolroom on an October afternoon 7 years ago, "You don't have to pretend here." And about the thing that had happened inside her when he had said it, the moment she had understood that she had arrived somewhere real. She had been running from danger, yes, from Denton and his violence and the consequences of knowing too much. But she had also been running from something else, something less defined, the possibility of being truly known and found insufficient. The possibility of taking off the armor and being vulnerable, and having that vulnerability used against her the way Denton had used her love for him against her. Silas had never done that, had never shown the slightest inclination to do that, had simply remained, day by day, the person he had been on the day she had met him, steady and honest and patient and unexpectedly, characteristically, exactly right. She walked home to the house, which was larger now than the original small teacher's house, having been extended twice as the family had grown, and found Silas in the yard with James, who was 4 years old and deeply serious about the business of helping his father with the fence post he was setting in the hard autumn ground. Clara was asleep inside, or was supposed to be, though from the sounds coming through the kitchen window, she was probably doing something else entirely. She stood in the yard for a moment and watched them, this man and this boy, before they knew she was there. Silas was explaining something to James with the same patient, attentive quality he brought to everything, and James was listening with an intensity that was entirely his mother's, the focused attention of a child who takes information seriously. She thought, "This is the thing I was running toward. Not away from Denton, not toward safety, though both those things were true, toward this. toward the version of herself who taught children and loved a man who told her she did not have to pretend, and believed it, and acted on it every single day. Silas looked up and saw her standing at the gate and smiled, and she thought, as she had thought 100 times, that it was the most entirely unfair smile she had ever encountered, and she would never get used to it, and she was glad. She came through the gate, and James abandoned his post-hole assistance immediately and ran to her with the single-minded speed of a 4-year-old who has been doing responsible adult work for a whole 20 minutes and has earned the right to be 4 again. And she caught him and swung him and set him on her hip and walked towards Silas with the specific, easy certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going. "Good day," Silas asked when she reached him. "Very good day," she said. Maggie Thompson finally understood long division. The look on her face was worth every minute of the past 3 weeks. "High praise," he said. "From Maggie Thompson, yes," she said. He took James from her hip, because James had transferred his gravitational preference to his father without apparent transition, and put his arm around her instead, and they stood in the yard with the last of the autumn light on the fence and the prairie beyond and the sound of Clara doing whatever she was doing in the kitchen, and Lucy thought, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." She thought about how it felt to stop. How the first day she had not packed her bag with the intention of leaving, she had lain awake most of the night convinced she had made a mistake, that staying was a trap, that safety was an illusion. How the second day had been only slightly less frightening. How gradually, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, the habit of running had loosened its grip and been replaced by the habit of staying, which was harder in ways she had not anticipated and better in ways she had not been able to imagine. She thought about all the women she had met in all those 11 towns who had been kind to her or cautious with her or both, and about the ones who had been running their own kinds of races from their own kinds of pasts, and she thought, "I wish I could write to all of them and tell them it was possible to stop." "What are you thinking?" Silas asked. She looked up at him. "That I want to write something," she said. "About the past years. Not a memoir, nothing so formal, just an account, in case it's useful to someone." He looked at her with the thoughtful attention that was one of the things she had always trusted most about him. "I think that's a very good idea," he said. "You always think my ideas are good," she said. "Most of them are," he said. "I tell you when they're not." "That's true," she said. "You do." She started writing in November, in the evenings after the children were in bed, in the small notebook she bought from the general store. She wrote about Abilene and Denton and the 14 months of understanding accumulating into the terrible knowledge of who she had married. She wrote about the running and the towns and the names. She wrote about arriving in Caldwell and the 40 days of preparation, and a morning when a man had crossed a street and asked a question that had changed everything. She wrote about stopping, about how stopping felt like falling and like landing at the same time, about how trust was not a decision you made once but 100 small decisions made repeatedly until the habit of it replaced the habit of armor, about how the person she had been before Abilene and the person she had become after were not the same person, and she did not want them to be, because the person she had become after was made of things the person before had not yet had to find in herself. She showed it to Silas when she had finished it, which was in February of 1886, and he read it carefully and completely without speaking, and when he finished, he set it on the table between them and looked at her with an expression she knew by then in its many variations, and this particular variation of which was one she saw only rarely, when something had moved him genuinely and completely. "This is extraordinary," he said. "It's very particular," she said. "One woman's story." "Not all stories are particular," he said. "That's what makes them true." She looked at her hands. "I don't know what to do with it." "Eleanor might know," he said. "She knows people in publishing in St. Louis." She looked up. "You think it's worth, I think," he said carefully, "that you endured something that many women have endured in some form or another and did not have the capacity to document, and that you have documented it with honesty and intelligence and a compassion for the person you were that I find very moving, and yes, I think it's worth." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman she had been, standing against a telegraph office post with a gun against her spine, looking across a dusty main street at a man in a brown duster who was about to change her life. She thought about all the pretending she had done, and the moment she had been told she didn't have to. "All right," she said. "I'll write to Alina." Alina wrote back with the speed and enthusiasm that characterized all of Alina's correspondence, and the account found its way, through Alina's connections, to a small press in St. Louis that published books of personal witness and social documentation, the kind of publication that was beginning to matter in those years as the frontier era closed and people began to want to understand what it had been. The book was published in the spring of 1887 under Lucy's real name, Lucy Blackwell Wells, because she had no intention of hiding behind anything anymore. It was not famous. It was read by a particular kind of person, women mostly, women in difficult situations who needed to know that survival was possible and that the running did not have to last forever. And some of them wrote letters to the publisher which were passed on to Lucy, and she read every one of them and answered the ones she could. Silas read one of the letters to her one evening, a letter from a woman in Wyoming who had read the book and then found the courage to leave a situation that the letter described with the careful indirection of someone who had not yet fully found the words. He read it and then set it down and looked at her. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. "Everything I wrote about came from what we built here." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement but in the way he had of declining credit he felt was not his. "You built this," he said. "You chose to stop running, that was yours." "You gave me the reason to," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the lamplit evening with the sounds of their children sleeping in the back rooms and the sound of the prairie wind outside, and she thought, "This is the thing. This is the whole thing right here." James started school in 1886, which was the strangest and most wonderful professional experience of Lucy's life, teaching her own child in her own classroom with the peculiar doubling of identities, mother and teacher simultaneously. He was, predictably, excellent at reading and challenging about arithmetic, and she was scrupulously fair about his marks, which he accepted with the equanimity of a child who had grown up watching fairness applied consistently. Clara started in 1888 and was immediately the most socially complex presence in the classroom, not disruptive exactly, but with an instinctive understanding of group dynamics that made Lucy suspect her daughter was going to be a formidable person in whatever direction she chose to apply herself. In the spring of 1889, Lucy discovered she was expecting their third child, which she announced to Silas over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the practical directness that had become their shared register, and he looked up from his coffee with the same expression she had seen twice before and reached across the table and took her hand with the same unhurried certainty and said, "Good, good." "You always say exactly the right thing," she told him. "Not always," he said, "just with you." The third child, another boy they named Thomas, arrived in November of 1889, stout and determined and bearing from his first hours the specific look of a person who intends to stay. The decade turned. The frontier era that had shaped the world Lucy had known was closing, the open range giving way to fences, the cattle drives diminishing, the towns becoming more permanent and less provisional. Caldwell settled into itself. The school grew. The law office became more about property disputes and less about men with guns, which was, Silas observed, both progress and its own particular tedium. He remained, in all the important ways, exactly who he had been on the morning he had crossed the street toward a woman with a gun at her back and decided it was worth getting involved. Steady and honest and occasionally, characteristically exactly right. She loved him with the whole of herself, not the breathless, performing love of someone trying to be lovable, but the solid, rooted, daily love of a person who has found her place and knows it. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, the 10th anniversary of their marriage in the small church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, They sat together on the bench by the water pump on the east side of town, the bench where she had first told him she wanted to stay. The September evening was warm, and the prairie was that long, gold-lit expanse that she had come to love with the complete, specific love you can only feel for a landscape that has been your home through all its seasons. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he confirmed. I've been in Caldwell for 11 years, she said, which is longer than I've been anywhere in my life. Do you miss it? He asked, moving. She considered this seriously because he asked serious questions and they deserved serious consideration. I miss the feeling of possibility that came with arriving somewhere new, she said. The blank slate of a new town that doesn't know your name. She paused. But I have learned that blank slates are not actually clean. You carry all the same things with you. The only difference is whether you let anyone else see them. He turned to look at her. And here, she said, I let someone see them. And he didn't run. Why would I run? He said. Most people do, she said, when you show them the difficult parts. Then most people, he said, with the quiet certainty that had never changed in 11 years, are missing the best parts. She turned on the bench to look at him fully in the golden September light, this man who had asked the right question at the right moment and changed everything, who had told her she didn't have to pretend and then made it true with every subsequent day, who had been exactly what he appeared to be from the very first moment, which she had not believed possible and which had proved to be the most extraordinary thing about him. Silas, she said. Lucy, he said. I'm glad I didn't get on that stage, she said. He smiled at her, the full smile, the one that was completely unfair and that she had given up trying to be unaffected by some years ago. So am I, he said. Considerably. She took his hand on the bench between them, the same bench, the same hands, 11 years of living between then and now, and looked out at the prairie in the last of the light, and felt the specific and irreducible quality of a life that is fully, genuinely hers. The hawk was still out there, or some descendant of the hawk, riding the high thermals in the evening sky, and the cottonwood leaves were still moving in the prairie wind with that sound like water. And somewhere behind them in the town, her children were in Mrs. Hatch's kitchen, eating the woman's extraordinary cooking and probably driving her gently to distraction. And the schoolroom was ready for Monday morning. And the sheriff's office lamp was burning the way it always burned in the evening. Steady and reliable at the center of the town. Lucy Blackwell Wells had run through 11 towns and 4 names and 3 years of solitary, exhausting survival, and she had arrived here, and she had stayed, and staying had turned out to be the bravest thing she had ever done. She held her husband's hand in the September evening and let herself feel the whole of it, the difficulty and the grief and the years of running and the extraordinary, unlooked-for grace of the life that had been waiting at the end of the running, and she was grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because the hard parts had brought her here. The prairie wind moved through the cottonwood leaves. The hawk turned on the high air. The lamp in the sheriff's office burned steady at the center of the town. And Lucy Blackwell Wells was home.